Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I am your host, John DeLynn. It is October 11th, 2022, and today we have in store for you what I think is going to be a really important and valuable episode. I am here joined by my wonderful, brilliant, wise partner, Margie DeLynn. Hey, Margie.
Hey,
Thanks
I'm
for joining
excited.
us.
I'm excited today.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
So always so glad to have you.
Thank you.
And we are here today to interview Louisa Killian. Hey, Louisa, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Just to give everyone kind of the brief introduction, Louisa has been interviewed on, was it Mormonism Live or Radio Free Mormon?
Mormonism Live.
Yeah, and we love Bill Reel and Radio Free Mormon. But there are so many really valuable and interesting things about today's story. If there were kind of going to be a headline, Louisa was a dance professor, adjunct professor at Brigham Young University, Provo. And during that time started to have challenges or struggles with her testimony. And so because that sort of scenario is now in the news, with BYU tightening its rules around temple recommends and worthiness and its faculty, along with the church recently asking that the priest penitent privilege for BYU professors be eliminated while they are still preserving it for sexual abuse victims. For all those reasons, this topic of losing your faith at BYU, especially as a professor, is really timely and something that we haven't covered a ton. We've covered it at BYU Idaho a little bit with Ryan and Holly Nielsen, I believe, and maybe we've covered it before, but it's in the news again. So I'm excited about that. We're also going to be talking about marrying really early and young within Mormonism and the challenges that can accompany that, and early divorce, I guess, as well. And then, of course, today's episode is kind of Thrive themed. So we've been experimenting with this Thrive series with Margie, and today is certainly going to be Thrive flavored, if not a continuation of the Thrive series, because there's going to be a heavier emphasis, kind of a lesser emphasis on the deep early story of Louisa's experience. But we're going to have a more heavy emphasis on the back end of the reconstruction piece and ways that she rebuilt after losing her job at BYU. I don't mind saying that, after a divorce and kind of rebuilding a life, maybe with a new partner. And then what about, life after with career or motherhood or any of that sort of stuff. So Margie is here, just being a great co-host, but also to help with one of the things that is her expertise, which is reconstruction. Anything you want to add to that, Margie?
No, I think you did great.
Ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's start.
Louisa, anything about the introduction that you want to correct or add to before we start? Any disclaimers? Sometimes people like to talk about why they're doing the interview or why they're not doing the interview. Anything you want to say before we jump in?
I think that was great. There were some spoilers in there. I think I just want to share my experience, and if anyone who I mention within this interview happens to maybe just be a little bit worried that I just don't want to hurt anybody is my thing. So everything I say is out of good faith. This is all from my experience, which means that some of it might not be accurate because it's my interpretation of my life. But I really want to share this in order to help other people, especially, I will say, the main reason is students at BYU at this time, but also anyone who may have married young and have similar experiences to me. I just want to give back. So this is not in any kind of animosity towards the church or its people.
Yeah. Yeah. And in addition, that's beautiful. And in addition to BYU students, just this past week, we heard of another BYU faculty member who resigned from BYU and has switched over to Utah Valley University. So I think it's for faculty too, because I am certain that between all the different BYUs and CES and other places, there are literally hundreds of BYU faculty who don't believe anymore or who are unorthodox believers and who are listeners and viewers to Mormon Stories. maybe your story will help them as well.
That is true. And there's also a lot of faculty who don't know what happens when they lose their faith. And I think it's really important to bring transparency to how that system works, even though they've been changing things even now as I speak. But it's true. But I just know that a lot of people say, well, you chose to work there. To me, the students are more vulnerable, but absolutely.
Yeah. And the professor I'm talking about was actually a professor of mine when I was at BYU a long, long time ago. His name's Chad Emmett. He was a geography professor, and he just came out as having left BYU and joined UVU. So shout out to Chad Emmett. We'll include the story in the Trib and maybe a blog post from Chad. But shout out to Chad and check out Chad's story as well. All right, Louisa. So without any further ado, give us like the high level couple minutes of like your early Mormon story in a nutshell.
Sure. I was born in Provo in Orem, Utah. My parents, my dad was from Kentucky and my mom was from Texas. So in that way, I felt a little unorthodox because I wasn't in the Utah bubble, and I was proud of that. But they met at BYU and then had me, I think, a year later after marrying, so pretty soon. And then we moved to West Virginia, Indiana, and Maryland within my younger formative years. And then when I was in second grade, we ended up in Rexburg, Idaho, which I know has been referred to the Saudi Arabia of Mormonism, according to you. And yeah, so that's kind of where I started.
Okay. So your Mormon story really starts to begin in Rexburg?
Yes, I would say. I mean, I have memories of living in West Virginia when I was younger. But really, it starts in Rexburg, Idaho. So
big family, small family?
Big family, 6 kids. I'm the oldest of 6 children.
Okay.
So it is 4 sisters and 2 brothers.
Okay. And I imagine you were called on to help with the raising of your younger siblings by your mom and by your parents?
Oh, yes.
Margie can relate to that a little bit. Margie's the second oldest of 6, but the oldest daughter of 6. So
yes.
And are you vibing, Margie?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I definitely took that role head on. I don't know if Margie did, but I was born a leader, I think. Very in charge and stubborn and used to taking care of people. So yeah, I embraced that role.
Okay. So like between your childhood and adolescence, any important things about your Mormon story? I'm going to assume your family home evening or scripture study or family prayer and regular church attendance and kind of no alcohol and tea and tobacco and swearing and just the typical Mormon stuff. Anything you want to say about your Mormon story that might be important or unique up before we jump to adolescence?
Yeah, so I was really proud of my dad. I really loved the fact that he I believed he was sort of converted to the gospel when he was 16. He had an abusive childhood, and he chose to cling to the church as a way to get out of that. And he wanted to be a better father and not have anger issues. And so I remember being really proud of his testimony and proud of who he was. And I felt like we were very orthodox in certain ways where we definitely tried to do family home evening, and there were discussions about whether playing cards were okay. Some of those funny Mormon stereotypes that come out. So we were ones who followed the rules, but we also, I took pride in the fact that my dad was from Kentucky. It was a little bit different. My mom was from Texas. We had artwork around the house. We were connoisseurs of literature. My dad loved Steinbeck books and Jane Austen, and I felt like that fought against gender stereotypes. For me, I saw him as somebody who respected both, respected my mother as an equal partner. And so I sort of grew up in this scene of really being devout, but being devout in in my mind, all the right places, I guess. We had artwork on our walls. We had one that, was an Egyptian hieroglyph that had a woman's breasts. And like, to me, that was, oh, that's not what Mormons do, because we don't put that up. So, so we had an artistic flair to our childhood and a critical thinking flair, which I really appreciated. And I really respected my parents' testimonies in that way. And I always resisted being a part of Mormon culture, whatever that meant to me growing up. But I really felt this sense of like, oh, there's this judgmental Mormon scene, or this scene where if you get too orthodox in certain ways, then you miss the point of things. And I was always sensitive. I always wanted to be different, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Okay.
Yeah.
So as you're entering adolescence, what are the important elements of Mormonism that kind of impact your middle school or high school years?
I would say obedience comes to mind, both as something that I really tried hard to do. In Rexburg, it was easy to be a member of the church. Everybody was a member of the church there, pretty much. So my values weren't as challenged as they could have been. It was just in the air. So I really wanted to be obedient and do the right thing. I remember that. But I also felt myself having friction against being forced to do things. So I was a very independent girl, and at a young age could sense the difference in gender roles, and felt like I was strong and I wanted a job and I wanted to do things that the boys were doing, but that I wasn't allowed to. So I have memories of like young women's leaders, like hugging me and saying like, okay, you're going to come to Mutual, right? And that made me not want to go to Mutual. So I had this slightly rebellious side where I really wanted to do my own thing, but I also wanted to be obedient and do what was right. I had a boyfriend when I was 16, so that's like a good example where, oh, you're not supposed to date until you're 16, seriously. So I didn't date until I was 16, but I had a boyfriend, which again was like, oh no, you're supposed to group date at 16. But I'm like, no, I'm going to have a boyfriend. So it was like, I guess that kind of summarizes it a little bit, where I was really concerned with being obedient and having my parents be proud of me, but of course testing boundaries.
Yeah.
And I think the big thing is going against things that I felt were unjust, like, you're trying to make me go to Mutual. That's not the point. I should want to go. I was really concerned with the heart of things versus the letter of the law.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Were you into dance in high school and before?
Yeah, so I did. I was a drummer, a dancer, and a writer. I had like a foot in all those camps. I did drumming a lot. I was in a few rock bands and drumline and concert band, those sort of things. And then I took dance once a week, and I danced all as I was younger, non-competitively, and I loved that. And then I also was a pretty good writer. Yeah, and I loved to write.
What are your 3 favorite bands to drum to in middle school or high school?
Oh, in middle school. Because I was like, I know the ones I want to. Like, if I could be Neil Peart, that would be ridiculous.
That's the right answer.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
No, I mean,
he's my favorite drummer.
You can't beat him. Rush, it's ridiculous. But at the time, right, it's like the 90s. So I was like Travis Barker, like Green Day, you've got those sort of drummers. What else? I also, though, was jazz influenced. Our family was very into jazz, which again kind of separated us from a little bit from the Idaho rural crowd. I was like, I hate country, right? I was standing on that front, which was funny. But no, we liked jazz, so I liked some jazz drummers. I would look back to like Buddy Rich, like the classic jazz drummers, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question too, just about the dance was there a type of dance that you naturally gravitated to?
Yes. So I say non-competitive because to me, my dance training was super healthy. Not that competitive dancing can't be healthy, but there is a certain aspect of competition that can sometimes have affect bad body images of yourself, and it can be tough to be judged on your body at a young age. So I always valued that I took dance that was jazz and lyrical based. And it was taught by a professor who knew kinesiology, who knew the body. So I was drawn to floor work. I was drawn to moving on the floor, using my upper body. I had a lot of upper body strength for a woman, for a girl. So I loved going upside down and being able to create new movements. Ballet was my least favorite, if that gives any indication of the type of personality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. How about writing? How did your love of writing develop? And then would you write on your own? Did you write stories? How did you discover your love of writing? And then how, where in your life was there a space for it?
Yeah, I was read to from a young age. So my parents would read to me. And we all grew up, all of our siblings, really, really good at writing. It was funny. One of my brothers actually got in trouble from his teacher who thought he had cheated because he was so fluent as a writer. I remember I really loved prompts, and I found out later that that's what I loved with English was prompts. So if a teacher would give us a creative writing prompt, I always knew how to spin it so that it was interesting, or I love to think outside the box. So I found places at school, or if people gave me different prompts to write at. I also won an essay contest, a national essay contest, and got to go to England with my dad to meet J.K. Rowling.
What?
Yeah, the prompt was like, if you could have a magical power, what would you have? And I wrote that I didn't want a magical power because I wanted to face life's challenges head on. Could be slightly Mormon. But yeah, so I really loved people giving me prompts or ideas and then kind of shifting or thinking outside the box of how to approach a topic.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Your dad ended up having some health problems. Is this the time to maybe talk about that kind of chronologically?
Yeah, because I was 15.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Maybe let's jump there.
Yes. So my dad was diagnosed with colon cancer and a brain tumor. And that was in January of 2005 was when he was diagnosed. And then he passed away in November of 2006.
And he was how old?
He was 41.
That's young.
Yeah. So it was before they had tested him. I believe he started having headaches and went in and got checked out, and it was colon cancer that had spread to a tumor.
Wow.
Yeah, so I was 15, and there were 5 younger siblings, and it was fairly unexpected. It was within a year that he passed away, and that was really hard. Yeah.
How does a wife with 6 kids, who is probably a stay-at-home mom, how does she and the kids rebound and survive after something, especially in a more patriarchal structure where the man was the primary provider? How do you even do that? How does that work?
That's a good question. Yeah. Luckily, my mom finished her degree. I always grew up believing and being taught that, a woman should finish her degree. Partly because the man lost a job, you have something to back it up. But my mom was always taught that, you need to get an education. So she was lucky in that respect that she had a degree to fall back on. She taught vocal instruction. Basically, you don't really recover. I think Mormons and LDS people and maybe even Western society, we like to say, how do you get over it? You don't get over it, I don't think. But what helped her was the community of Mormonism. So because we had such a close-knit ward, our whole neighborhood, we knew almost all our neighbors. They all rallied together and took care of us. And she was supported. And somehow you just make it work. I know that my mom did the absolute best that she could, and I hope that she doesn't regret anything because she was dealing with the loss of her husband and having to take care of 6 kids, and I don't know how anyone could function. I remember, seeing her cry and not being able to help her. It was really tough. But, that was one of the strengths of where we were in Rexburg, Idaho. We were very taken care of by the ward. And somehow she made it through at least the darkest times.
So she got a full-time job?
I don't remember. I know we had some assistants from the church, their food storage. I don't know if she was able to work full-time. It's all a little bit of a blur based on what I was doing. But I know that she did teach voice at BYU, Idaho, which was formerly Rick's College, and also had worked for the school district as a choir director.
So something between part-time and full-time.
Yeah.
You guys were able to survive with the support of the church, which, to the church's credit, sometimes the church can shine in that way.
Yeah. And life insurance, you know.
Right.
Well, luckily, we had an uncle who came and helped with finances.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question around that. So that's is that your first experience with grief and loss? I mean, clearly that magnitude, right? Being a parent. So at 15, do you have memories of what that looked like for you?
Yes. I would say this is my first instance with death.
Death.
Grief and loss, I felt like loss for sure.
Okay.
Loss for sure. I feel like I had felt grief at younger ages. My dad and I butted heads a lot. I was a pretty headstrong child and reminded me of him. And because he had come from an abusive background, he was really trying to be a good father. And I really appreciated that. And he ended so many cycles of abuse within his family. But we had some struggles when I was younger, growing up and butting heads. And I was the child where the parents learned a lot.
Yeah.
So I would say there was a little bit of trauma in that sense, but this was definitely where death came into the picture. And I just remember my instinct was to carry other people, turn off emotions. I would have moments where I would basically build up emotions until it all came out in one big pot. But I would be strong. And I remember getting mad sometimes when Relief Society sisters would come over and want to clean the house because they say, no, we're fine, leave us alone. So I put up barriers of being strong, taking care of my siblings when my mom couldn't. And I just remember carrying a lot of weight. And my dad, I think at one point told me to take care of your mother. And so I just carried people. That's kind of how I dealt with it. I think I remember seeing my dad pass away in our home. Right after he passed away, he was upstairs and they pulled me upstairs to come see him. So I saw death at a very young age. And how I coped was to work. I remember going to school the next day. I'm like, I'm going to go to school the next day. I didn't last. I had to call and have somebody come pick me up. But I just wanted to prove that I could handle it. Yeah.
So when you combine, and thanks for sharing something so personal and difficult, when you combine death of a father who you loved with a high demand religion and which encourages obedience and that has kind of a clear path for young women, and then whatever family or cultural dynamics that played, what type of trajectory or path did all of that set you on once you're 16, 17, being raised Mormon? What was the path that emerged for you? Especially as you mentioned obedience as a theme and also perfectionism as a theme that emerges.
And also the coping of I can take care of, I'm okay. I can take care of situations. I'm strong. It's almost like life interrupted in a literal sense where 1 minute you're 15 and then in another minute you're in a totally different role of, on some level taking care of, which maybe you had done a bit of up to that point, but I would imagine, maybe I'll ask that, but when you lose a parent and then you're actually needed and you can see you're needed. And on a level, the parent that's left is mourning and grieving and needs help. That's a really different role. It's a different feeling to be in that role. So that too.
Yeah, there's a lot there. There's a lot there. I feel like my first instinct with John's question is, I don't know, perfectionism comes to mind for some reason. So I knew the path. I knew what the path was. The path was to follow the commandments of God, to do what is right, to not watch things or listen to or bring any influence of the Spirit into your life that could mess things up or make it harder for you. The plan was to get married in the temple, to raise a family of my own, basically to follow all the rules of Mormonism. That was the plan. And that was what my dad had done in order to be a good father and to change his life for the better. And the plan never changed. But yeah, to your idea, Margie, then I suddenly was taking care of my mother, which was not fair. And I knew it wasn't fair. And I didn't know how to do it. But I had to do it. And I feel like maybe this is where your two ideas come full circle, is there's this idea I felt in LDS doctrine that if you do all the right things, it will be okay in the end, and Heavenly Father is there for you. And there's a plan. It's all a part of the plan. But we have to work and we have to do what we're supposed to do in order to make it. And so I always knew the things I was supposed to do, quote unquote, and I really tried hard to do those things. And it sounds simple when I say it out loud, but as a 15-year-old, I felt the hustle. You've used that word before. I felt the hustle of all the things I was supposed to do in order to be a good LDS child and also a good child to my mother. And Mormonism sometimes wants to sugarcoat everything in that, like, oh, I knew my dad would be there because he passed away and now he's in the next life. And that brought some comfort to my mom and to me. But there was a hole, and that hole couldn't be ignored, even though I tried to push it away. I didn't want to feel feelings that were sad because I think partly because that was scary for me and it wouldn't help anything. And you could always say, well, things are going to be okay in the end. So I should just suck it up.
So was your desire to see your dad again part of what becomes your religious devotion?
No, actually. I actually had conflicting feelings. And I will admit this. This is something that is really hard for me to figure out psychologically. When he passed away, I felt an immense sense of grief and an immense sense of lightness. My dad was pretty controlling, and we had a tough relationship. And suddenly I felt that control go away. I was afraid of him sometimes because he was bigger than me, but I loved him. It was this really interesting conundrum. So part of my desire to do good, though, I think, was not so much that I would see him again, but that could be part of it. It was that I wanted to do the right thing like he did in his life. And even though he had problems and he would always apologize to me after he realized that, oh, I shouldn't have yelled or something like that. He would always apologize. I really respected and loved my father. So that gave me kind of an earnestness to keep doing what was right so that he would be proud of me.
Yeah.
That space, I feel so much for that brain space of when you've experienced the difficulty of holding both things with a parent, that difficulty of holding how fiercely you loved him, all these brave, incredible aspects of his own journey, his courage, his healing, his confronting things that were so difficult, while also having to hold to, that at times you felt afraid, or at times you didn't have your needs met, or at times, and it's both. And that's really, really difficult, I think, psychologically. Our brains don't love that. We love one thing or the other. It's much easier, in my understanding. You can pipe in if my PhD psychology, but like my understanding is it's a different thing to process something that's all one thing. If someone is just consistently abusive or harmful, or that's one thing. But our brain can figure that out, and we can kind of have closure around what needs to be done in time, and with good support, clearly, and resources. But that complexity is something that's altogether different. So incredibly hard.
So where did your Mormon story take you from high school and beyond after your dad's death?
Well, I graduated high school, and the university was kind enough to give me and my siblings half tuition credit to any BYU school, although I don't think it applied to BYU Hawaii. So it was just the Idaho or Utah school. And that was really kind because the tuition was already cheap, and now I had half tuition credit. And my mom, because she was single, I received a Pell Grant. So I made money going to the church school. I didn't want to think about college when I graduated high school. So my mom ended up setting up the application for both BYU schools, and I filled it out. But in my heart, I really wanted to go to BYU Provo. I didn't want to go to the same school where I had grown up. Mm-hmm. So I applied for both schools, and I didn't get into Provo. And that was hard for me because I felt like I wasn't good enough. So I ended up going to BYU Idaho after that.
Okay. And how was BYU Idaho for you? I mean, staying home, maybe that wasn't your first choice.
It wasn't, but again, a little unorthodox, at least in my mind. I would have roommates who would go home every weekend, and I was told, at 18, you are out of the house. So my mom, don't come back for laundry. You need to go be your own person. And I really respected her for that. She wanted me to be independent. So I left home, and I would visit every once in a while, but it really felt a little bit like a separation where I could have a, college experience. And I knew what I was getting into with the church school. I knew there would be, dress codes and curfews and those sort of things. And I always thought, well, if you don't know you knew what you were signing up when you came up for. So if you're not okay with the rules, then don't go to school here. So I was fine following the rules, even though some of them I'm like, well, I'm working past 1. I don't care. So I knew the rules were there going into it, and it would be that experience. And then actually when I left for college and was on my own for the first time, then I finally allowed myself to emotionally grieve my father. So that was something that happened because I had held it all inside for so long. I finally let all that out. So discovered that I hold emotions in, which is a part of my personality and journey.
So what did that look like?
A purging. I didn't want counseling when my dad had died. My mom suggested that we do it, but I didn't want to. And so I resisted feeling emotion, went to college, lived on my own, and suddenly there it was. Mm-hmm. So I finally went, I think, to counseling and just let myself purge things. I was just kind of depressed. Yeah. So that was just a learning experience for me about how I'm dealing with grief and loss, emotions specifically.
And it sounds like one of your insights then from that time, is it true still, is this idea that you kind of hold it in?
Yes.
And that you, and then do you still have that cycle of hold it in, and then some type of purge or outburst?
Yes,
okay.
I still have that. I have a resistance to showing emotion and weakness. I'm much better now, but I did have a big resistance to that because that was weak. And I believe, too, that was also feminine. And I wasn't okay with being feminine in that way. I wanted to be strong. Yeah.
Because you perceived feminine as...
weak. Mm. Yeah, I did. In the church, too, I saw it and was presented with it. So...
Yeah, I'm curious. So it sounds like on some level you have kind of two, I don't want to say opposing, two different experiences. You have this heaviness, this grief. Grief can be very heavy. It demands attention, slow, right? You're having this, and it's very inward. And then you also have this moment of expansion, though. You're on your own, and you're having this somewhat independent experience with some space away
Yes.
from your family, right?
Yes.
So I'm curious during this time, what was your identity, would you say, if you were to kind of encapsulate who you were in these years of college and how you would have defined yourself? How would you have defined yourself? By what activities, by what adjectives, by what?
Yeah. I was still doing dance, so I was getting an English degree because I was always really good at that, and I thought I would pursue the degree. I was very driven to get an education, and not attend college to get married. I hated that idea. So I was there to get an education, loved English, was interested in that. I toured on a dance team during this time, so dance really fueled me. And I was loving the college experience. I loved to finally, in my mind, have education that applied to what I wanted to do, although I didn't like college classes where I had to jump through hoops. So I think I would define it as I was independent, and in the beginning I was lost and I didn't know who I was because I was suddenly confronted with myself. And I wasn't taking care of 5 younger siblings or my mom. And so then I felt all that grief and emotion. But then I processed it. I purged it a little bit. I met roommates. I opened up. And I really, I think, started to blossom socially and in my studies, I would think.
Yeah. That makes so much sense. Yeah.
Okay. So do we start talking about how you end up in your first marriage, or is there another important part of your Mormon journey before? For many Mormon young women, you go to college to get married. I don't want to say that's what your experience was, but that's what I've observed.
Yeah, and I hated that. Yeah. And I made fun of girls, not to their face, but I did. I would adamantly say, why are you wasting money going to school if you're just waiting to get a husband? I would consider myself in that way to be fairly feminist, which is hilarious because, yes, then I got married at 21. So this is when enters my first husband. So I graduated high school 2009, and then around 2010, my ex-husband entered the scene, and I want to say that I'm not going to mention his name. I don't want to hurt him in any way, and I hope that he's happy and healthy now. But I'm going to explain things in my experience that happened to me, and hopefully will help other people. That's only my intent, because there were a lot of things that happened between us that were harmful to me. So I do this not to hurt him, but just to share. I met my ex-husband. I had known him in high school, but he one day showed up on my doorstep when I had started college, where it was home for Christmas, and came by and just said that he had been thinking that he needed to visit me. And he showed up, and I was like smitten. So that was the beginning of this sort of relationship where he entered my life.
And so where does the story go from there?
Yeah, so he shows up and says, hi, and I'm like, oh, who are you? You're a little different than I remember from high school. And he said he was going on a mission, which to me, I was surprised because he was a little bit of a drifter in high school. And I was happy for him. And basically things kind of progressed before he left on his mission, and he told me that he thought we were soulmates, and I just fell head over heels for this guy. I was just really, really in love. He wrote me beautiful letters and brought me gifts and all kinds of things. And I didn't judge him for what his choices had been in high school, or who he was before. I was just happy he was going on a mission and was choosing the church. With me having a dad who had overcome things and decided to really follow the gospel later in his life, I really didn't care. as much about people's past. And I remember this too being a big thing where guys would come up and, I'd have a boyfriend maybe who said he had a problem with porn, and I was like, that's okay, that's fine. Like, those things didn't bother me, if that made sense. I was happy to forgive people for whatever their life was now and their choices.
So did he go on a mission, or
He did.
Okay, and so you waited 2 years, or he ended?
I thought waiting was stupid because I'm like, well, you change.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to wait, but I was still very much in love, and we wrote letters. It was funny because he was actually called to an Idaho mission, so he wasn't supposed to write me because I was in his mission.
Man, being from Idaho and then getting called to an Idaho mission, that might cause me to lose my faith, honestly.
It was something.
That's interesting.
Yeah, he saw relatives of his because he had a lot of relatives in the area.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I would apostatize.
Yeah.
And I was born in Idaho. Anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. So were you tempted to see him while he was a missionary?
Oh, so tempted. Yes. At one point he was in Idaho Falls, which was 20 minutes away from Rexburg, Idaho. I would sometimes think of driving there and just driving around and seeing if I could see him. But at the same time, I thought, waiting's stupid. I'm still going to date. So I dated during that time, and I had a few close relationships, but always I had him kind of in the back of my mind. Yeah.
What are some of the qualities when you kind of think back that kind of made him stick? If you think back to kind of what stood out to you about him, do you remember?
Yeah, he was confident. So I had a boyfriend in high school who was super sweet. And luckily we didn't struggle too much with law of chastity stuff as much. And he was a really nice guy, but he was a little bit more passive. And when my ex came along, he was very confident and knew what he wanted and knew who he was and presented him that way and knew he liked me and went after me. And I found that very attractive compared to maybe some other guys I had dated that were a little more uncertain. And I mean, the Mormon dating scene is intense. Like, you're not dating just to have fun. You're dating to get married. So I think that also made a lot of guys kind of, they don't want to come off too strong right away because that's frightening. Because then you're like, well, let's get married in 3 weeks. So he very much came on strongly. And he just said and texted beautiful things. And I think that really attracted me to him was his forwardness and confidence.
Mm-hmm.
So he gets off his mission, and how long did it take before wedding bells were ringing?
I did everything that I said I wouldn't do. Because I said, I'll get married at 28. That sounds like a good idea.
At age 28?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He gets home from his mission. He kisses me like the day he gets back. And then we get engaged and married. Let's see. He came back. We were engaged at Christmas. And then it was 3 months later we got married.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if you were going to say at that point, what you were looking for, what you had been conditioned to seek, what you had been taught to sort of value, what the major things that, you were looking for, what would you say to that?
Strong in the gospel, priesthood holder, partly because of my patriarchal blessing. I think if my patriarchal blessing hadn't said that as specifically, I might not have cared as much. But definitely strong in the church. I wanted somebody who would be my partner, who would respect me. I wanted someone who would view our relationship as equal, who was intellectually the same, who would appreciate my interest in dance and English, who would be open to doing. I really appreciated how my dad was open to things that would be considered more feminine, and in that way, not be overly, I don't want to say masculine, but like overly dominating.
I see.
As a partner, perhaps, or just open to liking things no matter what stereotypes told them. I wanted somebody who was kind. I think those are the main ones. It's hard to go back. Yeah.
And did he seem to meet all those check boxes?
Oh, yes, 100%.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he's a returned missionary.
Mm-hmm.
And were there any red flags that you, now looking back, ignored that you want to share?
Yes. He sent me a letter on his mission that said he had beat up his companion. And at the time, I was like, oh, that's hard. And I was sort of on his side. But looking back, physical violence was probably not a good thing. There was also something when we were dating, he came back and I think we were engaged. And I had a friend who like took my car keys, threw them into the snow. He was being funny. And my ex started a fight with him. And after that happened, I told him in the car, I said, "That you're really cruel. That was cruel." And I didn't agree with that. So that sort of behavior was a red flag. But again, I forgave it and overlooked it. The other red flag was law of chastity things. I had always been pretty good. I made out with my boyfriend in high school and looked up if that was okay on the Strength of Youth things and found out it kind of wasn't, but that I was okay because we weren't touching and da-da-da. So I had done that, but when we were engaged, he touched me twice. And one, he had tried to touch me lower and I moved his hand and it was kind of unexpected for me. The second time was actually our marriage was in jeopardy, our wedding. We were sitting with siblings at my family's house, and he touched me under my shirt. And I wasn't expecting it because we were watching a movie and my siblings were around, and I never would have wanted that. It wasn't like we were in the heat of a moment. But he touched me, and afterwards I went upstairs and I said, "Okay, we need to go to the bishop." So I turned us in. I said we need to go in, and for some reason, I thought it was my fault too. So we sat there, and because he had been through the temple, he was on the chopping block a little bit more than I was. I was told not to take the sacrament for a while, but our wedding was in jeopardy because of that. Looking back now, I realize that was not my fault at all. Mm-hmm. But at the time, and even in my journals, I write that, we messed up on chastity issues. We did this, and it's because we love each other so much. But it totally flew off the radar for me that, no, you didn't do anything in both instances.
So at the time when you were having the experience, did you have like a consent alarm? Is that what initially happened, was when you were like, I wouldn't have wanted that in that situation, that you were having some type of boundary alarm of not necessarily wanting it, but then afterwards, the way you processed it was that it was the both of you? Or do you think from the beginning, just curious, as a woman who has absorbed, messages, and now consent is a word that, is hopefully well discussed. But do you remember that? Do you remember this feeling of like a boundary being kind of like, no, I didn't want that, or a consent issue, just an alarm bell, and then processing around it? Or did you always feel like from the beginning it was my fault too? That was mine to hold too. It's okay if you can't remember. I just think it's interesting.
I remember, luckily I had a very strong sense of self-esteem as a woman, and about my body. I had a very body positive experience, which I am very grateful for. So in that way, I didn't blame myself like, oh, I was wearing something, or, oh, I'm provocative. But what I did was something, happened and I wasn't expecting it. And I remember like taking his hand and like patting it and saying no. Like, it was almost like I viewed the situation that we had both messed up. It wasn't entirely my fault, but somehow I had contributed to it. Mm-hmm. Is that making sense? It's like I didn't even think that he was the bad guy ever because I loved him so much. Mm-hmm. So it was about forgiving and being like, I love you. You have beautiful intentions. This is only because we love each other so much.
Got it.
And it's not a bad thing because you love me.
Yep.
Yeah. So you got married.
I did.
And how were you thinking about balancing education, career, and early marriage once you got married?
Yeah, well, I had graduated right before we got married. Luckily, the wedding was allowed to go through. He had to have a disciplinary for what we had done. And then we were allowed to get married in the temple. He wasn't able to be there for my endowment because of what we had done, but we were able to get married. I had just graduated, so I had my degree. He was just starting because he got back from his mission. We were the same age. So the idea was I would be the breadwinner in a sense while he was in school, and he would go to school. So I had to find a job in Little Rexburg, Idaho, which was pretty concentrated of students, so it's hard to get a job. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. I had an English degree. I applied for a few secretarial jobs and things like that, but I hadn't done any kind of internship, so I was sort of thrown into the job market. I ended up working at a daycare, which wasn't my first choice, but it made money. It's actually from Melaleuca, which is an MLM. But I worked at their daycare, and then I also taught dance part-time, and I loved teaching. And I sort of chose to do part-time jobs so that I could keep teaching dance. That's where my heart was. I also worked at like a weight vest company, online weight vest company. So I was working part-time jobs, and he was going to school while we were married.
Okay. And so if you had to say kind of how things went wrong in the marriage, how would you describe it? Like what happened?
It was like a bomb went off, and it happened quickly. We got married in the spring of 2013. And around this time, my mom also remarried. So she was married in that winter, December. And then I was married right after her, which was kind of a fun experience. Within that year, around that December, the first thing that happened was he talked to me about stealing money from a cash register in the temple. We had worked there as temple workers, the clothing rental. And so there was a cash register where we worked. I would give out the women's clothing. He would give out the men's. And he told me at the time he stole some cash from the register. And I remember kind of being shocked. And throughout that conversation, the way it ended was I was comforting him by the end of it, because he was upset that I wasn't supporting him, and he was afraid I would react that way. So it was odd because I was hit with this blow of, oh, you were stealing things. And then by the end of the conversation, I was comforting him. And I don't remember how long it was until then, but then a few weeks later, the cops, or maybe a week, the police showed up at my door and arrested him for felony charges. And I had no idea what those charges were. So that's how it began.
Wow.
That's how it began.
It's one thing to steal. It's something to steal from the temple. Like that just seems, for a returned missionary Orthodox Mormon.
Temple worker.
That seems unthinkable to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And then as things, came out, and again, I hope he's in a good place now. But as things came out, it turned out he was stealing all over in different parts of his life. So at certain jobs, he had stolen things. He stole credit cards from BYU students. That was how he was initially caught, was stealing credit cards and spending them. He got fired from a job because he was stealing things. So this stealing thing had been happening in multiple areas. He stole from a locker in the temple. A worker didn't lock it. That's really interesting when you start to think about, there's locks in the temple, the most holiest place for the Mormon. No. Yeah, there's locks there for a reason.
Had you prayed to know whether you should marry him?
Good question.
And had you gotten an answer?
I did pray. I didn't receive an answer either way. And so I thought, okay, well, then I'll go forward in faith.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So you find out he's got this history of theft. And how did things go from there?
So he was arrested. He was taken to jail. I was approached by a family member to bail him out, and I said no. We were separated for a few months. and I tried to decide what to do. So everything started to come out. We eventually met with the bishop, and that's when I found out he hadn't told me everything. The bishop knew that he had stolen and said, "Tell your wife," and he didn't. So there were lots of like meeting with the bishop to the side because the church had to hold a disciplinary hearing because it was a felony charge. He was eventually charged and was given probation. And I basically, during this time of separation, decided whether to stay. So I was tormented with having to decide whether to stay with this person. And I have in my journal like lists of people in my life who had opinions on it. Like I still really cared what other people thought in my life. So my family, was really worried about me and kind of wanted me to get a divorce. My grandpa said, "You should get a divorce." My grandpa also said, "Don't go to the bishop. He'll tell you that you have to stay in the marriage." Bishop said, "Yeah, you should keep your marriage going." So I just had all these voices telling me, which way I should go. And I would go to the temple and I didn't get an answer one way or the other, but I felt like I was getting revelation of like, this is what you need to do now. This is the next step to take. But never was it, "Here's what you do, Louisa, so that it will all be okay." And that was really frustrating because I hadn't done anything wrong, but I was terrified of the future. And I mean, we got married in the temple. This wasn't just a marriage. This was eternally. This was forever. And I remember thinking that before I got married, before we walked into the sealing room, I thought, "Oh no, this is a big deal." And I kind of wanted to run away. But by that point, you're there. You're getting sealed. And so I wasn't just going to throw away my eternal marriage for nothing. So I just spent months trying to decide what to do.
Thinking about that now, what 21-year-old is capable of deciding who they're going to live with, not just for their entire life, but for eternity? When you dated 3 months before your marriage, I mean, I know you knew him before, but like, that's who's capable of making that decision so young?
But see, God would have told me if it was wrong.
Yeah.
In my head. It wasn't just my decision, it was God's. This was the plan for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. At least that's how I viewed it, right? Like, oh, this is the one. This is my soulmate. And he made me feel that way. So, yeah, this was, I was doing all the right things. This should work out.
So it sounds like the church culture plus his charisma or charm convinced you to stay with him in spite of all these felony theft charges and this history. Is that right?
Ultimately, well, I mean, that was pressure. Yeah. Ultimately, it was my decision. And in the end, I decided, I think I had been to the temple and I felt that God loved him. And I thought, well, God, if you love him, that's enough for me to stay. And I also regretted, I thought that if I leave him now, this is the first time he's been arrested for a felony charge, which is why he got probation, because he stole a lot. There were multiple counts of theft. If I don't give him a chance, I might regret it. So I really wanted it to be my decision, but the reason I took it so seriously was because of the church. Absolutely. I had saved myself for somebody. So it became much more serious. But I do feel like ultimately it was my decision. I didn't feel like God told me to stay necessarily, but he told me it was my choice, is what I felt like in the moment.
And you decided to stay?
I did.
And then how'd that go?
We went to counseling from an LDS counselor, which was an experience. But one thing that I took out from that was he said, if this happens again, what are you going to do? And I said, if this happens again, I can't handle it emotionally, I'm out. So I did make that decision.
You found a boundary.
Yes.
Within yourself.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And I stated that boundary.
Yeah.
So that was really good.
Mm-hmm.
I chose to stay. I visited him while he was in jail, and that was a bizarre experience where I'm this little good Mormon girl in Rexburg, Idaho, going to a jail to visit my husband. Somebody asked me if I was the girlfriend when I showed up. I'm like, no, I'm actually married. Looking at my husband behind the glass, talking to him on the phone. It's just like not at all the picture. And I never understood why. And I don't know if anybody has that answer. I never understood why he stole things. So I never had any kind of closure of, why did you do these things? How can I help? We went to counseling both individually and together, but I never understood. So there wasn't really trust because it was so confusing.
Yeah.
It didn't make any rational sense to me. We didn't need money, if that made sense. Anyway, I never got closure with that. So we, at that time, I applied for the University of Utah for their master's program in dance. And I went to that audition with my mom because he was, I think, in jail or we were separated. So I went down and I applied for the program and I got in. Because by that point I had decided I really loved teaching dance. And English hadn't panned out for me. That's when I figured out that I liked English prompts, but I don't know what else to do with it. So I moved to Salt Lake, University of Utah. He came with me. He got to transfer his probation here. And we started anew. It felt like a new start up here.
Mm-hmm.
It's so interesting because as you're kind of talking, it reminds me of this idea of compounded loss. Because at the beginning of your college experience, it feels like you had a minute of space, you're grieving, and you're starting to kind of, build an identity, a life of sorts. And then you're doing all the things, and by the way, you've already kind of been hit by life in a way that is traumatic, that, how does one prepare for something like that? And then you're going about that, and you've just kind of opened the loss and you're getting support for that. You get married, and then you're hit with another. I would imagine there's betrayal there, but there's also loss of like, why am I here? How did I get here? And again, another situation for like, how, like you were kind of saying, how does a 21-year-old reason and make these calls about someone's psychology and what it means? And did you feel loss at the time? Did you have that sense of a heaviness of like this person, this chosen person? You're showing up, you're doing all the things, that you've kind of learned about, and yet your experience is deeply traumatizing. When I think of who I am at 21, I'm quite still innocent to the play out, let's just say. What did that feel like? Did you have a sense of that loss during that time of being hit by something heavy?
Like a loss of innocence, you mean?
Yeah, and a loss even of, I don't know, did it hit you at the trust of the formula yet? Like, I'm doing all the things. How did I get here? Like, am I protected? I'm supposed to sort of...
I married the RM.
Yeah, like I'm doing all the things. Wait.
Temple marriage.
Yeah, this was definitely not in the narrative.
Yeah, it was a bomb that went off. And it was bigger because I didn't see it coming at all. And so one minute you're happy and think everything's okay, and the next minute police are at your door.
Yeah.
And and I'm like, what about the spirit? Like, should I have been warned that my spouse was going to do this? Or, I started second guessing my marriage. I prayed about it. Why didn't God tell me no? So then you start to go with, well, I'm supposed to go through this for some reason. And does God want me to stay with him or not? And it was so frustrating because I didn't ask to be put in that place. But I had to decide for me and for my future children. I felt the weight of posterity on me. I'm going to stay with this person, and I could have children with this person. But I had already made the decision eternally.
Yeah, that that idea of eternal marriage, there's a face of it that's so beautiful. It's like, whoa, we can live together forever. On the other side, it's like you're locked in, you're sealed. You're not going anywhere. I mean, they even use the term sealed. There's no getting out of it. It can make you feel bound to something that maybe you shouldn't feel eternally bound to.
Yeah, and it was confusing because the bishop, who was my spiritual leader, was saying I should stay. And I remember sitting in that office and him telling me, basically, you should probably work this out. And I remember thinking distinctly, what if I was your daughter? Would you want me to stay in this relationship? Because my dad wasn't alive. And he couldn't tell me what to do. And he couldn't protect me. And yet I was sitting here in this office, and this bishop, is telling me that I should work out my marriage based on what he sees. And he knows that my spouse has lied to me. But it doesn't affect him. It affects my life forever. Yeah, and it's just, you have all these people around you who judge, saying, oh, well, I didn't think he was a good person. Yeah, so I felt so helpless. And I really tried to cleave to God into the temple, and I would go to the temple and really feel like that's where I felt what I should do next. But it was so confusing. And then to have a counselor who would use biblical references to try to keep you in a marriage. It was just, and marriage. I'd never been married before. I didn't know what sex was. I didn't know what a healthy marriage was. I was just going along with what had been taught to me. So, yeah.
Yeah. You don't know what you don't know.
You don't know what you don't know. And all I wanted to do was the right thing.
Yeah.
But that was confusing, that the church itself was telling me to stay. But those people who loved me closest were telling me to leave. And I wasn't seeing any future in sight. God wasn't telling me what was going to happen later. All I could do was have faith and make a decision and try to protect myself. But it's not like I knew anybody who had been through that experience. Oh, your husband cheated on you, and for whatever reason. I didn't know why my spouse was stealing things and not telling me about them. I just felt like I had no resources except for the little revelation I was getting from God.
And what's doubly hard is a Mormon bishop can have a conflict of interest because he would be representing the church that's going to lean towards stay in your marriage, families are eternal, you got sealed. And so he's not trained to be a marriage counselor, and he's biased. He's going to be biased by the church's preferences for you. And then your counselor is also church affiliated, church appointed, same thing. And so you're not getting, one of the things a mental health professional commits to is a code of ethics that includes not imposing their values on the clients. But here you're trusting a therapist and a bishop who kind of probably are imposing their values on you, even if they're not doing it intentionally. And that's not what's best that's not always what's best for the member.
To be fair, the therapist asked me when we got started, am I helping you with a divorce? Am I helping you stay together? There was that.
Yeah.
The bishop, their job is to keep the marriage together.
Yeah.
That in an abusive situation, 99 out of 100 times is horrible.
Yeah.
Because then somebody who's being abused stays in the marriage because they're going to make it work. Because the person, and I'm not saying I was abused to a certain extent. I'm talking about, people who are, because if you have somebody who's hurting their spouse and they're saying, I'm repentant, I'm going to keep trying, that person will stay in the relationship,
right.
At least in my experience.
Yeah.
That's hard.
There's just tremendous vulnerability. Also, I'm noticing that pattern of being conditioned to look outside ourselves, you looking to like, what does God want me to do? And when you pray, it's like, what does God want me to do? What does my mom want me to do? What does my uncle want to do? And all the opinions and everything's kind of outside yourself. And you've just hit a situation where it is like, if you could have a connection with yourself, this would be the time to like really, what do I feel? What do I need to do? But like you have to develop that to have that in a moment like that. So it just leaves you so incredibly vulnerable and in a place where, you did not have the resources to self-advocate.
And I had taken care of people my whole life. I was really good at putting myself on the back burner.
Yeah.
I had a great sense of self-esteem, but at the same time, I could be walked on for other people. That's fine if they needed me. And that's a bad combination for being taken advantage of, for sure.
Yeah.
So how do you get from University of Utah to BYU?
Yeah.
And what happens to your marriage along the way?
So I loved my U of U experience. That graduate program was amazing. I just loved it. And that was where I got exposed finally to different points of view. I had a grad cohort and I had people of different sexual orientations and different religions and people who swore and I say that because I read my journal and those are some things I mention. Finally, I was in a place where there was diversity in thought and in lifestyle. And I had craved that younger, but I hadn't received it in Rexburg and had to go to a college in my hometown. So at the U, I was exposed to all these really great people of different backgrounds. Things started to feel like a fresh start. So that was nice to move away from family, to have a new ward, a new bishop. Nobody knew us. Nobody knew our past. It felt like a fresh new start. So we started rebuilding things in our marriage, and we spent a few years at the U. And then my last year there, as I was finishing up my thesis work, I had a woman come over to my apartment asking me about dance. She wanted to go talk about it. So I said, okay. As we were leaving to go, we were going to go to a coffee shop and talk about it. We got in her car, and there was another woman in the car from my apartment complex. And she said, I don't want to talk to you about dance. I need to tell you about your husband. And she showed me text messages that she had received from him. They were pictures of text messages, so she wasn't showing me the whole thread. And basically, my spouse was asking if, basically advocating for sex, saying, I know you're having troubles in your marriage, I can give you sex. And so it was a bomb again, where I didn't feel like I had very much of a warning again. I had kind of a weird feeling about this person had stayed over at our house once because they needed a place to stay. And my husband had offered her rides to work, and I offered to come, and he said, that's okay. I had little nudges, but I wasn't prepared for that. So they showed me that, and that was the second bomb. I went back to the apartment, called my bishop, ended up staying at a neighbor's house in the apartment complex. We lived in the graduate student housing complex. And I went over and I confronted my ex with the text messages, and he confirmed that he had sent them. And the next day I presented my thesis work.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't my final proposal. But yeah. So that was the second bomb that dropped. And I remember staying over at the apartment of my friends, being terrified of going back to the house with this person. And I had not been on birth control for about 3 months because I thought we were going to have a baby. And there was only one time we had unprotected sex, and I remember thinking, what if I'm pregnant? And then I remembered thinking of abortion being an option. And that was the first time I was confronted with that reality and understood why people consider it. And I say this because it's come up and also because that's a hot topic now. But that was really unexpected too, of realizing that if I had a baby with this person, I would then be associated. Like I would have to have contact with him, with somebody who I was terrified of for the rest of my life. Luckily I wasn't pregnant, but that was a distinct moment of fear that night. Yeah.
So did that end the marriage or not?
Yeah, because I told him if it happened again, then that would be it. So I said, okay, we're getting divorced. And this was interesting because the bishop that I met with this time had to flip his tie on his shoulder, which I've had people do that. One person did it at BYU, Idaho, when they were talking about things that weren't considered doctrine. And he said, I'm not saying this as a bishop, but I agree with you, your decision to get divorced.
So there are bishops where when they want to talk in an unchurch sanctioned way, there's a ritual of flipping the tie to say, now I'm going to say things that the church wouldn't want me to say. And I'm not a bishop. I'm now speaking as a man, not as a bishop.
Yeah.
I've never heard of that before.
I've also never heard of that.
Oh,
wow.
yeah. It happened in a class at BYU Idaho when they were talking about the curse of Cain. He flipped it and talked about,
Well, I mean, I guess I'm glad that he was able to step out of the constraints of his bishoply role and give you advice that was probably better for you, but not what the church wanted him to. I wonder if that was it all. I wonder if there's cognitive dissonance in his mind. It's like, I'm going to do what the church doesn't want you to do and tell you to do what's best for you.
I think people do it all the time in those roles. Yeah. I think they know what they're supposed to do according to policy, but we realize that life changes. And I appreciated that. He was a wonderful man. He supported me as a woman to divorce my husband. And he hadn't seen any of the prior stuff. I just told him about him briefly, but he knew. And that's the thing. I my whole life I've had to rely on the instinct of men in authority to tell me how they feel about my life in different situations. And if they have an instinct that's sympathetic, sometimes that can help me. If it's not sympathetic, that can make it harder for me.
Wow, Louisa. Wow. That's powerful.
So feeling dependent on male validation.
Of course.
Yeah.
Because they're my spiritual leader.
Yeah.
And deciders.
Deciders. Yeah.
In many ways.
I hold them more as having more authority over the future. So I take advice from women in my life who I believe, have spiritual instinct, but my bishop's my bishop. He's supposed to have even more sight and care over me.
And special powers to know what's best, right? It's his domain
So I'm curious in this time, the significance, what it meant to you or for you to have a world that you created that was just yours in dance. The significance of that.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I have this dual existence where as a woman, and even as a woman in the church, I've been strong and independent, and I say what I want to say. I have no problem raising my hands and disagreeing with a bishop. I have that persona, but at the same time, I have this passiveness of like helping other people and sort of sacrificing myself in a sense. So that's interesting because dance and the education aspect, I was flourishing. That's where I was happy and really growing as an individual and as a person. And then for some reason, in my personal life or in my church life, feeling that be either stifled or even, I don't know, taken advantage of in some way. There's two things happening at the same time, I think. And it's weird to feel like I'm put together. I'm applying for a master's. I'm the one doing all these things to get us XYZ or whatever. I feel strong in this area. And yet I'm being pulled back. I don't know. Yeah.
Did you feel a sense of joy and a sense of what did it mean for you when you could dance? amidst, and you kind of were in this space of, feeling a little less acted upon, let's just say.
Yeah. I will say that at this time for my master's program, I was studying to become more a choreography and teacher. So for me, it was the creation aspect of dance, where I was being a leader. I was leading classes. I was leading my dancers. It wasn't so much as a performer, although the physical exercise definitely helps, get me out of that headspace. And I did perform for the performing dance company at the time. And I was so excited to get on that because I haven't always been a strong performer because I've been drumming and doing other things. I built up my technique so I could finally perform on the team, and I cried when I got it because I was so happy. So for me, the performing and the physical definitely moves the mind to a completely different realm. And you're able to really refresh and rejuvenate and just focus on the present. But also as a creator and as an intellectual, that space was so freeing and beautiful and just opening up all new kinds of thoughts and really, a distraction for sure from the pain of other things going on. I think if I didn't have that, at this point I became pretty suicidal, trigger warning. And I was at a really, really low. This in my journal I can see, thinking of attempts of suicide and things like that. And if I hadn't had my grad program, I would have been in a lot worse off, I think.
Yeah.
So so you graduated. Did the divorce happen with the graduation? And then how did you get to BYU?
Yeah, so we separated in October, and then our divorce was finalized in March. And then, and then that spring I graduated. Technically, my thesis, I think, was approved that summer. And I landed 2 adjunct positions at Snow College and BYU, so working part-time at both universities. So I moved to Provo, and I would commute to Snow College Tuesdays and Thursdays and teach at BYU Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So it was like having a full-time position without benefits. Yeah.
Okay. And that's kind of exciting. You were rejected when you applied to BYU Provo as a student, and now you're coming as a adjunct faculty. That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
And maybe that sweetened the bitterness a bit of the divorce. I don't know.
It was really wonderful to have somewhere to go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I didn't have to move back in with my family, and I was so grateful to have a job. Yeah.
No, but like for a believing Mormon, BYU is a special. There are a lot of people that want to get hired at BYU.
I guess for me, I didn't see it as like, oh, I'm excited to teach at the Lord's University. I was more excited to have a job.
Mm-hmm.
But BYU does have a very strong dance program, so I was really excited for that program. So I looked at it more intellectually than I did spiritually, which is how I approached my undergrad.
Yeah.
I'm not here to get a man. I'm here to get an education.
Yeah, good for you.
Yeah.
And what did you teach at BYU and Snow, actually? What classes did you teach?
Because I had my master's, I was able to teach a lot. I taught technique through modern dance technique, beginner through advanced, and then as well as a few lecture courses, freshman seminar, introduction to dance, I believe, some choreography classes, composition classes, beginner's ballet.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, basically whatever I could.
So when you teach at BYU, what, do they ask you, do you have to have like a ecclesiastical endorsement? Is there a discussion about the honor code? Is there a discussion about temple recommends? Is there a discussion about worthiness? What commitments do you make to become a faculty at BYU?
Yeah, so when I emailed them, I emailed the dance department and said, hey, I just got my master's. They emailed me back, asked me to come teach a class. So I came and taught a class. They observed me. After I taught the class, the the professor asked me if I had a current temple recommend, and I said yes. And so that was it. I don't know what would have happened if they said no, but she asked that right off the bat. And And then it was my understanding that sort of like a student, when you go to teach for them, you have to be endorsed by your bishop every so often in order to keep your standing at BYU. So, yeah, same kind of thing for students.
So it's vetting to make sure you have a active current temple recommend.
Verbally, yes.
Verbally. And then just your ongoing bishop approval.
Yes, and I believe in my application, the first time I had to sign up online, I think it did say, do you have a temple recommend? And I think it also, I know it for sure asked when I was applying for a full-time position and met with a general authority for that one.
That did happen?
Yeah, I applied for a full-time and I got the final interview. I didn't get the job, but I was in the final 3.
Okay, so what was that like talking to a general authority about becoming BYU faculty? What was
Yeah.
Are you comfortable talking about that?
Oh, yeah. I brought his name so I could remember who it was.
Okay.
Yeah, but what I was going to say is on that application, it even asks you what your calling is. It says, what's your calling in the church, which I thought was fascinating for a job interview. And part of me, it did happen too when I applied for the adjunct because it said, because I was like, I get to put Relief Society counselor or something. And I was like, that'll look good. I had that thought. And then I had the thought, wait a second. I shouldn't care about that. All callings are equal, right? But that was interesting that they ask you what kind of calling you had. Yeah, so I applied for a full-time position there. I was asked to apply, and I got down to the final 3, which meant I went to church headquarters and met with a general authority. And I wrote about it afterwards because it was such an interesting experience. So, you drive in under that underground parking and you get to go into that big building and they're, telling me that Holland and Uchtdorf and all those offices are right around the corner. As I'm entering, I see Elder Christofferson and like, wow, there he is in person. I met with Elder Cornish of the General Authority. And when I entered, it was kind of like almost a wooden kind of temple feel. There's like dark wood, and it feels very business-like but temple-ish, if that makes sense. Very clean. And when I entered, I almost felt like, why am I wearing what I'm wearing? I was wearing like a bright-colored shirt. I felt very vulnerable, kind of as a woman. And I entered and I met with him. He had a woman secretary. And I was struck by 2 things. One was he asked me what I thought about the honor code. And I said, you know what? For me, it's about obedience, even though we know not why. I gave the quote from the temple of, and it's in the scriptures from Adam says, I know not why I give this sacrifice, basically. I'm being obedient, even though I don't know the reason. And he said, that's the telestial answer. The real answer is that it's obedience that brings forth blessings. And I thought, so it's about obedience. He said, Satan was kicked out for rebellion, and we need to be obedient. So that was really interesting that I found out from him that the ultimate source was obedience and not necessarily my answer.
There's that Mormon teaching that obedience is the first law of heaven. So the celestial answer is obedience.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which to me felt a little wrong. But then the second thing I appreciated was I bore my testimony, and he said that testimony is like bricks, and it's okay if you don't have all the bricks, you do 1 brick at a time, and that's enough. And I thought that was really generous and gracious. But yeah, I remember distinctly feeling unworthy, which was weird for me.
Why do you think they have general authorities interview prospective BYU faculty? What do you think his role was?
They told me over and over, I am not in charge of getting you a job. This is not a part of the job interview. And in my head every time I thought, well, why am I here? So they told me that they do not have any influence over who they hire. I can only think that they want to keep an eye on things, or they actually do have influence on who they hire. But they told me it has nothing to do with that. They just like to get to know the faculty or something.
But it's before the decision's made.
Yes. Oh, yes. It's like the final interview you do.
And do they emphasize what they expect of you if you are to get hired? Is that part of it?
That I don't remember. Yeah.
Here,
I know
there it
they
is.
brought up the honor code, so
Yeah.
maybe that's sort of passively introducing things they want me to uphold, right? Like, don't talk badly about this. Yeah.
Were there questions about apostasy or criticizing the brethren that you remember? Anything like that?
There was temple recommend interview questions.
Okay.
Yes. And I remember now having to answer the divorce questions at that time.
Ooh, how was that?
Weird.
Well, like what divorce questions?
I wish I could remember verbatim. And so maybe this was more of like a general authority temple interview. But they asked if you had been divorced. And I believe they asked the reasons why and if I was paying child support. And I was happy to be able to explain why.
Yeah.
But they definitely asked about my marital status and divorce state.
I'm a tiny bit surprised they would well, they didn't hire you, but I'm a tiny bit surprised they would consider hiring a single person, because my sense is that church leaders might feel threatened by single women in professional roles.
I don't think so, because at BYU, Idaho, there's a single woman who applied for a full-time position at the dance department. I wouldn't be surprised if they view dance as something not as important, honestly. I could see them caring about that maybe for religion classes, but I don't know if they care as much. I could also see them giving preference to married people. And again, I think it probably depends on who is a part of that committee.
Got it.
That's my opinion. Yeah.
Okay. So how was it teaching at BYU?
Wonderful. They had a great, huge dance program, lots of dance classes. I was teaching like basically as much as I could as an adjunct, full-time load pretty much. I got to go to New York as a part of a festival and go to the LDS Arts Festival. So I loved it, and I loved the students. I did a few unorthodox things where I taught there. I would ask preferred pronouns at the beginning of my class. Again, I got my master's degree at the U, so that was part of the training as a teacher. Was you want to make it a safe space for all types of students. Even though we're at BYU, I was happy to call anyone by their preferred pronoun. I only had one student approach me and ask for me to say they, and that was after they had taken my class, and then I didn't see them anymore at BYU. But I did offer it. And I would also sometimes show a little bit more LGBTQ friendly videos, dance videos, things like that. But so in that way, I felt like, maybe I'm skirting the line a little, but I mean, it was wonderful to teach there. I loved the students. And at that time, they were filming the Book of Mormon videos. And I had boys in my class with long hair, and they were allowed to have that because they were in the Book of Mormon videos. Funny things like that. But loved the dance department. Good people there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess it was at BYU where your faith started to be really challenged. Is that right?
Yeah.
How did that happen?
I got married again. Yeah.
Okay.
I met my second husband, and I had a real spiritual problem because he was a non-member. And yet he was a better person than my ex-husband member had been, at least to me.
How'd you meet him?
I was...
if you want to say.
Yeah. No, I met him at the U. I was stage managing a dance show, and he worked at the theater there, and he was running sound. So we met there and started dating. And initially I thought, oh, well, this will be fun, but he's not a member, and my patriarchal blessing says priesthood holder. So there's no way. And then we fell in love, and we're dating while I was teaching in Provo.
Okay.
Yeah.
So while you were BYU faculty, you decided to marry your husband?
Yeah. He began investigating the church again. So there was maybe hope that we would get married in the temple. But I didn't want him to do it for me, which is really hard to separate. I wanted him to, explore it for himself. I had to get my sealing annulled for my previous husband. So that was interesting, having to talk to a guy on the phone about getting it annulled and getting the First Presidency to sign off of it. But eventually I decided to get married, and we did it during the pandemic. We had both been married before, had a big wedding. So we decided to elope in the mountains. And because it was the pandemic, we couldn't really invite his mom or anybody. They live farther away, so we ended up just doing a short little ceremony with the two of us. My bishop officiated, and it was really beautiful. And I went forward kind of in faith of like, well, maybe he'll join the church after we get married. But that was a long process of trying to decide whether to marry him.
Did he tell you why he didn't want to get baptized?
He had been baptized when he was younger.
Oh, okay.
Shocker.
Okay.
But he had been, I guess, less active for most of his life.
And at some point he wasn't a member anymore?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. For most of his life, he wasn't. And then he ended up getting the priesthood while we were dating. So he was kind of testing things out. He had a lot of questions about the word of wisdom, about priesthood. That was interesting seeing it from his eyes, because when he got the priesthood, he's like, okay, that was interesting. I didn't really feel anything. I thought I would feel something. Or he noticed, okay, I've been off coffee and alcohol for a long time. I don't really notice anything different. And I kind of miss those moments where I would drink a little whiskey while camping. Those helped me feel closer kind of to God and nature. So, so he kind of tested the Mormon thing. And some things he really liked. He discovered a closer relationship to Jesus. But he was in the arts as well, technical arts, and had many LGBTQ plus friends and associations, had a big problem with the church in that respect, and of women's rights. So all things that I agreed with were reasons that he struggled with the church, and he wasn't sure about giving tithing to the institution as well. So the reasons he wasn't in the church, I understood and also supported as a believing Mormon.
Yeah.
But I had never really been challenged too much myself on that.
Yeah.
I'm curious if I asked you the same questions that I asked about your ex-husband this time around, like what you noticed about, what's your husband's name?
Joe.
So what were some things that like stood out to you about Joe, having had the experience that you had with your, do you remember kind of meeting him and what really meant a lot to you or stood out to you?
Yeah. With my first husband, I was immediately smitten and just fell. With Joe, I wasn't immediately head over heels, and it took me a little while to get in, which I think was more healthy. This time around, I didn't trust words as much. So my ex-husband was really great at writing beautiful things and saying beautiful things, but the actions didn't reflect that. And with Joe, I was really interested in his actions, and I saw the types of friends he had, and I saw what he would do for other people. And a word that I felt in my previous marriage was disposable. And in this relationship, I felt equal and supported. And he was genuinely kind and loving and would come and take care of me. And it was weird, but I found out what empathy was from a partner. For some reason, in my first marriage, there was a lack of empathy. And there were moments when he would hurt me and not feel any remorse. And with Joe, I suddenly felt kindness, empathy, remorse, all those kind of normal human responses. He was also very witty and intelligent, and I really loved his clever phrases. We had a lot of similar interests and fun adventuring together, and intellectually I felt much more supported as an equal, both through conversation and emotionally. Yeah.
And if you were going to say, so this time with Joe, what qualities, what values, what things you were kind of looking for to build a relationship, having had now what did that look like? Like your other list was like,
priesthood-holder.
Yeah, that's right. And went to, what did it look like? Your ideas or, things that kind of, stood out to you that you wanted, that were important to you.
Well, now I knew that you can be a priesthood holder, you can work at the temple, and you can say all the right things, and you can be lying about that. So you can have the appearance of checking all the boxes, but not be a very good person underneath. And I don't know how else to say that. I know we shouldn't black and white people, but to me it was, the outward facade of righteousness and inwardly not so much. So honesty was huge. Honesty was huge because I had big trust issues after what had happened. Honesty, kindness for sure. Being able to recognize their own mistakes and ask for forgiveness, how we worked through problems, being able to talk through things, bringing up conflict, caring. Those were like the really big ones. Responsibility, being able to take responsibility for things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yep.
I have to say that one of the saddest types of stories I hear is when a Mormon finds their true love, finds their human, or someone that they really feel like they're going to vibe with, and they end that relationship because it's not an active believing member. And then they go on to marry someone who ends up being either at best not a good fit, at worst a complete jerk. And it's just this Mormon bias we have that you got to marry within the faith, and that somehow membership in the church and even a returned missionary status makes you automatically a better partner than anyone else, when the truth is there's so many amazing humans out there, and sometimes it's hard to find a really good fit. So when you find it, you want to feel like people will seize it. But then when they let that go and then they marry a Mormon and then the marriage is flailing, how many times do they then reconnect either during or after that bad marriage? It's just tragic,
Yeah. And in this instance, people could maybe blow it off and say, well, culturally, you shouldn't have judged people. I was going off of my patriarchal blessing. The church told me who to marry. So in this instance, I feel like if I hadn't had that blessing that was as explicit, maybe I would have been more forgiving. And like, well, you're not a member, but you're a wonderful person. And I was not in a happy place. But because my patriarchal blessing said it so explicitly, I was so tormented by that. So in this instance, it was the church that told me exactly who to marry. And I believed in that. It wasn't something culturally of like, well, you're not going to be a good person or a good priesthood holder. I mean, it was so sad that I had to learn healthy behavior from a non-Mormon. Like, he wasn't my spouse yet. But like the fact that I hadn't experienced that, I felt was so sad. I really felt like at 21, I was thrown into I chose to be in a situation where I was primed for maybe some abuse, I guess. Anyway, it was really sad to me when I started dating Joe and how happy I was and noticing like, oh, you care about that? Or, oh, the way that you're showing kindness and love to me, I haven't experienced that. That brought me to tears a few times.
Yeah.
And that to me is sad. That's a loss. That's a loss.
And it's amazing you found Joe and you
So
married
amazing. And didn't have kids.
him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, nice job, Joe. Keep it up. Keep up the good work. So was that a beginning of a crack in your testimony, marrying Joe, but being at BYU and trying to navigate the dissonance of being married to a Gentile, so to speak, but you're at BYU or not?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, because I have this plan from God and it's not playing out the way that they told me or the way that it says it should. Go marry a priesthood holder and have sons and daughters come to your family. That wasn't coming true. So, but I'm trying to do all I'm supposed to. And I remember thinking, God, why would you let me fall in love with somebody? All I want is to be loved and cared for. I haven't done anything wrong. Why would I reject this wonderful person because he doesn't check all the boxes, which I don't think are important anyway? So yeah, there was this real dissonance between like, God, I'm really trying to be obedient, but I love this man a lot. And this doesn't feel right to reject him for things that I don't think are important. And I'm not saying that priesthood wasn't important, but the check boxes weren't important. The meat of the priesthood, the ideas of the priesthood, most of those are important to me. Like, that's what it should be about.
So tell us how your faith began to deteriorate while you were BYU faculty.
I began watching, so since my husband, I had watched a lot of documentaries about different systems of influence. I would watch some serial killer stuff, which was a big, following right now, kind of about lack of empathy personalities to kind of dissect what I had been through. And during that time, I fell upon Scientology. So I'm watching the Scientology documentary, Leah Remini. And I started seeing some similarities between the Church of Scientology and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that was scary to me because I had already been lied to by a spouse, and I didn't want to be lied to by an institution. So I really wanted to make sure that whatever institution I was following had good intentions. So I noticed similarities in the structure of having a founder who everyone kind of revered in the church. And I was always taught that Joseph Smith had flaws, so I was okay with that. But I did sense this whole kind of worship personality. So that was one. And then also the structure of the church, the secrets of the church, the fact that we didn't release where the funds were going to, some monetary things. All those things, I started to go, wait a minute, is that in my church? Patriarchy a little bit started to come out, that word. I had learned it in grad school, which is funny when I start confronting patriarchy and racism, all those things that didn't exist in the Mormon bubble in Rexburg. That was the past. So those stuff started cluing me in.
But then as your faith starts to erode, it's probably constantly in the back of your mind that this is your job we're talking about here.
Yeah.
You love your job, you need your job. And so what do you do with the tension of wanting and needing and loving your job and watching your faith slip away, knowing that at some point those things might come to a head?
Oh, they came to a head sooner than I wanted because I'd seen that documentary. Stuff had started clicking in my brain. I started realizing that I had never tested anything. I've always worn my garments. I've always followed the word of wisdom, never had alcohol. I tried like sips of coffee. I'd always followed the rules. So I thought, well, maybe I will test it a little bit. And I should preface this too. So I realized that there's the intellectual distancing from the church. That was happening with Scientology. The spiritual distancing happened because that whole year prior, I had been reading Come Follow Me. And I'd been reading scriptures and writing down notes. And scriptures were always hard for me growing up because I never understood context. And as an English person, a literature person, I was like, okay, scriptures are a thing, but I'm not quite sure how to interpret all of this because I want to know the background. So that year I really focused on studying the scriptures, and I was praying to know if the church was true because I was deciding to marry this guy. And I really needed to know if the church is true because if it was and my patriarchal crossing was true, then I shouldn't get married to Joe. So while I'm doing this spiritual journey, that whole year, at the end of the Book of Mormon, I prayed to know if it was true again. And I had prayed earlier when I was a child or a teenager, but I sort of didn't get a huge answer. And then I thought, well, that's because you already know. And I'm just going to keep going off good feelings. So now I prayed after doing all that work and after being really sincere because I wanted to do what God wanted me to do. And I didn't receive an answer. And I felt so betrayed by God because I had been in a marriage with a priesthood holder who had abused me in different ways. And I will say that with confidence. I had tried to follow the prescribed things. I had given my life. I had stayed in the gospel through all of that. And now I meet a non-member. I really want to know if this church is true. And I don't need much. I just need a little feeling to keep me going. I'd studied that whole year. I'd written down questions. I'm sacrificing part of my independence as a woman. And I didn't get anything. So that to me was the big spiritual concave. And then it was logically, Scientology, and what is the church doing as an institution? Those were 2 parts. I don't know if I got away from your question.
No. So you try to get an answer, you don't get an answer.
Yeah.
And then you decide that there are too many uncomfortable parallels between Mormonism and Scientology and other high demand religions. So then I imagine you start thinking, well, maybe this church isn't true. But there's this quote from Upton Sinclair from the book The Jungle that says it's impossible to get a man to see a point of view when his livelihood depends on not seeing it. There would be a lot of people who are BYU professors who would just say, "Oh, I'm going to put that back in the bottle. I'm not going to let that genie out of the bottle. I'm going to turn it off. I'm going to pack it down, and I'm not even going to allow my brain to go there." So that's one scenario, is just to turn it off, pack it down. Another scenario is, I'll let myself go there. I don't believe anymore, but I'm just going to hide. I'm just going to hide and lie and just fake it, because it's not, number one, it's not fair for them to expect me to not have my beliefs change. But also I want and need my job. So option one, door number one, is turn it off and pack it down and pretend you never doubted. Door number two is fake it and lie. And then there might be door number three. So how was that process for you?
Yeah. Yeah. So faith stuff, I decided to try out, maybe not wearing garments, maybe not paying my tithing, some of those things. I get a call from my bishop. So yeah, this is where decision time comes. This is during the pandemic. So I haven't been to the temple in a while because they've been closed. My faith crisis hits. I'm really concerned about being misled by this church. My bishop calls and said, my endorsement, it needs to be renewed. I live in Salt Lake now with Joe. My bishop doesn't normally take care of these. He doesn't live in Provo, so he's not sure how to fill this out. He knows that I've been having some faith questions because he was calling me to a calling in the primary presidency. And I was honest with him and said, I'm having trouble with the church. And I'm not sure if I should be in this calling if I'm having questions. So he knew I was struggling. So he called me and said, how do you want me to fill this out? I know your recommend has just expired. So this was kind of a perfect storm where my faith crisis started. I hadn't decided if the church wasn't true or not, or if I, was stepping in or out. I was still going to church, all these things. I was just testing things. And then I get a call from my bishop. And that was the moment where I realized, oh, my job's on the line. And I remember being so terrified. And when he called and said, how do you want me to proceed? I haven't seen this before. And I think it asked just one question. It was like, do they have a temple recommend? It was very sparse. And I said in that phone call, I think that I wasn't sure, but we were going to set up a time to meet. I hang up with him and I just bawl because I'm like, I love my students. I love my job. This is my income. Luckily, I got married. If I was single, this would be even bigger when I was supporting myself with those 2 jobs. But I realized that my job was on the line in that moment. And it was at the beginning of my faith crisis, not near the end, not when I have made any kind of decision. So I was just terrified.
So why not door number one, just turn it off and pack it down? And then I'll ask you about door number 2.
I had packed emotions down my whole life. I knew that didn't work. I will say if you've ever been through a faith crisis, everything around you is crumbling. And because this was tied to my previous marriage, I had been taken advantage of by another human. This was scary to me. I don't know how to explain it. It was scary to me to feel like I was being taken advantage of. Also, I don't lie. That's a bold statement. I say white lies like everybody else, but for me as a person, my whole existence in the church was always to be genuine and honest. In classes, I would try to say what I honestly felt. I'd get down to the real things. In Sunday school, I'd be like, that's great, but what about the real issues? Let's get real here. Let's not deal with the perfectionist, fluffy stuff. And I was raised that way. So my relationship with the church was an honest one. And I couldn't imagine living my life pretending to be something I wasn't, or relying on temple recommend questions like my husband had done. And I wasn't going to compromise my integrity for a church school. So I don't think I can live inauthentically. I don't think that's built into my DNA. I've tried to live that way my whole life, and I've tried to absolutely not do it based on my previous experience with my ex not being authentic at all. Hopefully that's not too braggy, but.
No. Yeah. And so the option, door number 2 of like faking it wasn't, I guess your commitment to honesty didn't allow that either.
No. My preference would have been for me to take my spiritual journey on my own, because it's private and personal, and keep teaching at BYU and keep building testimonies and things that I believe in, principles of the gospel I still do, and work out my stuff with Joseph Smith, church history, and current church events on my own. But I was forced to bring that into the light with this phone call.
Yeah. And what do you make of the fact that there are probably hundreds of BYU professors that do choose doors number 1 or 2? I'm sure they would take umbrage at being characterized as being liars or dishonest or whatever. I guess it's none of our jobs to judge, so maybe it's just a bad question. But I'm totally aware that there are many, many, many who are, and not by choice of their own. It's like a bad situation. They're just forced to either turn it off or hide or lie because the consequences are too great. I guess I want to almost withdraw that question because it's not ours to judge.
Oh, yeah, but I like it because, in my opinion, rarely do people lie, I think, out of malicious intent. I think rarely. There are exceptions, I think, where people lie, like my ex-husband, just because they like deceiving people for whatever reason. I don't think many people can live that way. I think because religion is sticky and because there are many things you can go back and forth again, you can choose to be progressive on, you can choose to be nuanced on. People can choose to stay for certain reasons that they want to and support those reasons. And it's hard because I guess what I'm saying is I don't believe that a lot of people are outright liars. I think we have to live authentically in whatever way we can. So they'll make excuses for certain things they don't agree with, or they will, in a sense, build where they can. So I know a lot of professors there who don't agree with everything that the church does, but build and lift in the things that they do agree with and do it in a beautiful way. And they've decided that they can stay in the church and do that. Some people step away from the church because they can't be in the church anymore because it doesn't reflect their beliefs or values. My opinion is there's a lot of gray area people at BYU, and they can get away with that as long as they hold a temple recommend. And to me, it's all about how you view those recommend questions. I was not at a place of spiritual nuance or maturity to be like, I'm going to say yes because of all these exceptions that I've made in my head, and I feel good about that. For me, it meant literally because I was grown and taught that those questions were literal. So that's what honesty meant to me in that moment. And I don't necessarily judge people who nuance, but at the same time, I think there is something really, really courageous about people who they take care of their family with that income and they choose to stand up for what they believe. Because I, thankfully, was not employed full-time and was not taking care of a family with the income. So, in a sense, I could afford to give away some adjunct, even though it was hard. I get why people do it.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. If you need the health insurance, especially if you joined BYU, not having a faith crisis, but you have it while you're there, and then you need the job, or you realize there are a lot of people that won't hire me because I'm at BYU. And then I may need the insurance, or I may need the income, or for whatever reason, there's probably a lot of people that just feel trapped.
And I think it comes down to how you view the temple recommend questions. That's what it comes down to keep your job. If you think that the system is stupid in a sense by checkmarking things, and the profits are going to catch up to you eventually, answer whatever you want on the questions. In a sense, Mormonism created me as the good things that Mormonism gave me are giving me the strength to not lie or to, I don't know, not disregard that, if that makes sense. Church taught me to have integrity, so I'm not going to nuance the questions.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
I know what they mean, and I'm going to say what I know they are. I'm not going to come up with my own answer.
Yeah.
But whatever. They'll probably change in 5 years.
Yeah, they do. So you decided to be honest with your bishop about your doubts, even if it meant putting your job in jeopardy.
Yeah. And I was trying to figure out, too, if the church was what it claimed to be. So
Maybe get
I
help.
was curious. Yeah, I was curious if there was help for me. And I didn't know if I would lose my job. I didn't know how the process went.
Yeah.
There were a lot of unknowns.
Yeah. So how'd that go?
I worked with my bishop. He said that BYU would be jerks to let me go initially. And I laughed, but also was like, oh, they might. He didn't feel good about giving me a recommend, and I supported that because I didn't know what my answers were to all the questions. I knew I believed in God and Jesus, but I had trouble with some of the institution stuff, and I was trying to figure that out. Also, church history. I was finding more out about church history, and polygamy meant a lot more to me because I had been in a relationship that wasn't good, and polygamy to me seemed like something God shouldn't ask of me. So there was that. So I'm struggling with those questions, but I don't not like everything about the church. I'm still an active member. Regardless, he didn't feel good about giving me one, and I didn't feel good about having it. So I worked with him on how to respond via email to the university. Eventually, it got to a point where he asked for a number he could call to talk to a real person because he wanted to advocate for me. He didn't think I should lose my job. So he calls the university, has a conversation with somebody from the endorsement office, which I believe is separate from the honor code office. These are two different things. Calls the endorsement office, talks to the person on the phone. They're not able to answer his concerns, so he's passed up to a supervisor. And basically, he's just asking, like, what about the word on the temple recommend questions? You know, what if they're trying? What if they have questions? You know, how can I spin this, basically, so she can get a recommend? And the answer that he was given by the supervisor was that she is now considered telestial, not celestial, and we do this for the safety of the students. And he relayed this to me in a meeting we had later. He said, this is what they told me. He brought out scriptures. Joe was with me in that meeting. And he said, these are the scriptures they gave me. You are considered, less than. And he didn't say you are considered less than, but that's what I felt as he told me you are right, telestial or terrestrial. And I just cried. I realized that there was not a place for me to have a faith crisis at BYU. I had reached out to HR on my own and asked about circumstances I knew that non-members taught there. And I learned that non-members are allowed to teach there if they've never been baptized into the church. But if you've ever been baptized in the church in your life, even if you are baptized and then have been Catholic all your life, you can't teach at BYU. And I was desperately looking for resources to help me. I wasn't out of the church. I was struggling to decide what this church was. And I was given 90 days to decide if I was going to answer affirmatively to the temple recommend questions to keep my job. And it felt very, very manipulative. And from that point on, the bishop kind of was like, well, this is the policy. It went from being kind of caring and advocating for me to be like, this is our answer. And that told me a lot about how BYU feels about students and teachers who have doubts.
Right.
I mean, I guess we don't know his heart, but in my kind of suspicious mind is like, was he extra kind and warm at the beginning, almost to make you feel comfortable disclosing, so that then you disclose and then the warmness goes away?
No, he wasn't that kind of a guy. He was just a good Salt Lake bishop who just wants to go to church and was thrown into this situation. Yeah. No, I didn't get the sense any of that.
But the warmth went away, you're saying.
Yeah, because he had to make a decision. Am I going to continue to empathize with this person, or am I going to support the church, which was BYU's policy in my mind? He chose to support the church, so he had to distance himself emotionally from me a little bit because he can't empathize with me now. Here's the scripture. And maybe he's figuring it out in his own head. But
he could have flipped his tie.
He could have flipped his tie, yeah. Or he could have been like, well, this isn't fair. BYU is horrible. But not his temperament. Yeah. And if I would have been in a college warden provo, maybe I would have had a bishop like that who was a little more progressive. You hear about that, right? Like some teachers or students having a bishop who's like, those are fine questions. I'm going to approve you.
Yeah.
But because he had never done this before, he didn't know, and I didn't know how to handle it.
Oh, there's absolutely, and not just in a student ward, but you could go to parts of Salt Lake or Park City or even parts of Provo if your bishop happens to be an intellectual or a liberal Mormon, where you would get a bishop that would be like, hey, as long as you're doing good there, I want you there. You know what I mean? I've had friends called into bishoprics as non-believers, and they're told, I want you in the bishopric because you're a non-believer. So, I mean, there's this idea of bishop roulette where absolutely there are professors at the BYUs who are non-believers because they have bishops who protect them.
Yeah. And I could have protected myself.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to be honest. And why is God punishing me for being honest again?
Yeah.
When my ex-husband was dishonest and got up the ranks.
Especially because dance, it's not like you're teaching evolution or dance, you're not going to be having to deal with topics that might challenge the faith directly of students. I'm guessing.
I'm supposed to build testimony, and I do that in my classes. Spirituality, love, kindness, community. We bring up quotes in the lecture classes from prophets. I can do that. I can support those good things. I'm not teaching about Joseph Smith.
Fanny Alger.
No.
Kinderhook plates.
No.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah.
Well, so how did that end?
I felt manipulated by the university for the 90 days. Mm-hmm. And I found it impossible to have an honest journey for my faith during that time because I just felt like this was hanging over my head. And the severity of the action they took of holding like, well, you're telestial, you're not good enough, gave a sour taste in my mouth. And so I was like, well, then it felt like going back to an abuser, which is weird. But that's what it felt like. It felt like you're not doing what we told you to do. We're not offering you support because you're in a deep, dark place, which, by the way, we've caused these problems. So you have 90 days to give us the answers we want. Otherwise, you're gone. That didn't feel respectful for me as a teacher, a person. They didn't reach out to my dance department. My dance department hired me as long as they could. They were super supportive. They wanted me there. They would have advocated for me if asked. A few of them, gave their sympathy to me. So they didn't judge me, but the institution absolutely did. And that just gave that I couldn't work for them. And I knew I couldn't resolve that kind of pressure within 90 days. So I stepped away and I lost my job.
You didn't make them fire you?
I did. What they do, because I'm adjunct, is they don't renew my contract.
Right.
So I would have made them fire me if I worked full time. But no, they just don't renew your contract. So
by not getting bishop approval, the bishop informs them and all of a sudden you just don't get the call or you don't get the email or the letter.
Yeah, I have a specific time I could work and I worked till the very end. And then they're not allowed to hire me. HR stops the process because I don't have that temple recommend box checked. Mm. And I didn't sin. I didn't do anything wrong. I just was testing and questioning my faith. That's all I did.
Wow.
Well, this is a harsh perspective, but in some sense you committed the worst sin from the church's perspective. Apostasy is worse than probably almost any sin.
Then they need to stop teaching from the pulpit that they love people who step away or have questions. If that is the case, they need to not teach that over the pulpit because we're getting mixed messages. I'm taught from Dieter Uchtdorf that I'm okay to have questions and doubt and that it's a part of life. But the policies, cut you off as soon as they find out you have any chance of being an apostate. Because I didn't feel like an apostate. I felt like a member who was hit over the head with all these questions at the time.
Yeah, that's the thing is on some level, what I'm hearing from you is you hadn't decided yet. You didn't have a chance to actually have the process. The process was interrupted with like disciplinary action on some level, right? So your point about the apostasy thing would make sense if you had, to my mind, actually made a conclusion of some sort or an assertion of some sort. But what you're saying is you were just basically saying, I'm struggling, I'm having questions, where can I go? Where can I have support? What do I do?
Yeah, and my bishop, he didn't want to answer my questions about church history. I mean, if anything, he would be the one I would counsel with to resolve some of these issues. He didn't want to go into my questions or doubts. I brought them once. I'm like, here are the things I'm struggling with on an email. And I just brought them to the meeting just in case they would come up if he wanted to help me. We never had discussion about them. He just knew I was struggling. I mean, who else? My non-member husband?
Yeah, where do you go?
Where did I go? And it's scary. Anybody who's been through a faith crisis, everything crumbles.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
Yeah. It's okay. It could have been worse. I could have been a student in my mind.
Well, there are hundreds of BYU faculty right now going through the dilemmas that you went through. How long ago?
That was 2021 was the beginning of my faith crisis.
The last year.
It's so
January.
recent. That is so, wow.
Yeah.
Mm.
It was a perfect storm too, right? Like where Temple Recommend expired just as something's starting, all of that.
Yeah, the timing part.
Yeah. And my family wasn't going to support me in it completely. That's the sad thing too.
Any of your mom or?
Yeah, like my family, I mean, if you're having
Siblings?
a faith crisis, they also don't want to touch that subject as much.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. So the bishops weren't equipped to help you. Your family's not equipped to help you. So maybe just talk about what it was like to lose your job for no fault of your own, really, for just learning the truth.
I was just having flashbacks to my first marriage again, my divorce. Like all I'm trying to do is what's right. And yet I keep being punished for trying to do what's right. And I'm not saying I'm a saint and I always do what's right, but I'm really concerned with my personality, doing the right thing. Blessings, obedience brings blessings. And yet the more I try to do what's right and be honest and all that, I'm getting punished for. I remember in my research looking at different things, and I was looking at Fair Mormon videos. There was one where they were interviewing someone who had gone through a faith crisis. I believe it was one of the Kwaku videos. They were interviewing this man who had gone through a faith crisis, left the church, and then he had this miraculous experience where missionaries showed up at his door and certain things fell in line to where he had to move to Utah. And God was showing him all these signs to move back to Utah. And now he's a part of the church and he's in full fellowship and everything happened. And I went in my shower and I bawled and I just lost it. Why doesn't God give me anything? And he's given this man on this video all these signs that God is there for him.
Yeah.
And so I was trying to do what was right. And I was trying to do all the things I had told, pray, read your scriptures, ask people. And honesty was right to me. And I had been honest in church my whole life about my struggles. I'd been honest with my struggles and my testimony in church. I'd brought it up in church lesson. I'm struggling with the Book of Mormon. I prayed and it didn't come true. What can I do? I felt like a convert. And yet, because I had been associated with the organization and in some sense was going back to being a convert because I was questioning, I was rejected. And if I had gone to BYU and said, I've never been a part of the church and I'm struggling and I'm learning things about your faith, I would have been welcomed with open arms. So it's just so hard to want to do the right thing and yet to be penalized. I never wanted to hurt my students. That hurt me when they said for the safety of the students. I love my students and I never wanted to hurt anyone. I want an atmosphere in my class where everybody feels comfortable to share. And, I would ask preferred pronouns so other people felt comfortable. So why was I being penalized for honestly sharing that I hurt and that I struggled with my testimony after all I had sacrificed and all the abuse that I had been through in my first marriage and all the tithing I had paid and all the callings I had been a part of. But 90 days to decide. Otherwise, you lose your job because you're not good enough. You're not good enough because you loved people. And you just want to search what's true for you and not be hurt anymore.
And it's particularly serious because it's your career.
Yeah.
Right? And like, it's also severe for a student, a BYU student that goes to BYU believing, but then 1 or 2 or 3 years into their degree, they lose their faith. They face potentially getting expelled and maybe even having to redo 1 or 2 years. There's the time and the expense and the inconvenience. That's really serious. Maybe for a faculty member that gave up other options that probably, like I said before, limits their future career options just by going to a school like BYU, when there's a lot of problems with BYU's reputation these days, it just seems so serious that they would make decisions that would impact someone's career so significantly without providing a year or two or job finding support or something that would show sensitivity to the seriousness of the situation that they're putting people in.
Yeah. I mean, at this point, I'm not teaching at Snow College. I had moved to Salt Lake. That's too far to drive. This was my only university position, and I still have not had another university position since that time. I still don't have a job. That was something people told me a lot. They said, well, go find another job. Just go find a job. It's the pandemic. I'm in the arts. I'm in dance. It's hard. Anyway, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's part of it. That's part of the struggle. And I don't regret that. And I don't want to go, wow, that's me. Because, yeah, people could give up their full-time work. Students are much more harmed than I was. But, yeah, I still don't have another university job. And I loved it. Yeah. So.
Well, this has been really powerful and beautiful. And I think it's a good place to say we'll end part 1. And what we're going to do is come right back for part 2, which is going to be your reconstruction, how you've grieved, how you've processed your grieving, your healing, how you've reshaped your beliefs, your worldview, your identity, your life, your marriage, your mental health. And maybe Margie will kind of step in and take a bit more of the lead for part 2. Is that all right, Margie?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Any final thing you want to say for this episode?
You got me to cry. Good work. We did it.
Good job, Margie. Way to make her cry. Just kidding.
No, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for being willing to share something so difficult when this story just needs to be told, because it's telling these stories that's going to help make it so the church and BYU hopefully someday makes it easier for people who are or will be in the shoes that you were in.
Yeah, and I guess if I were to tell anybody who is in those shoes right now, student or teacher, I don't judge you either way, your decision. And that's what the university should have told me.
Yeah.
In those moments of tenderness of deciding your faith, is I don't judge you either way, whether you choose to stay or leave.
Yeah.
And that you need that freedom to make that decision.
Yeah. I'm just going to say it's really, really clear just listening to you and, feeling you, that what you were offering, that thing, the safety, the really seeing people, valuing people, this sense of openness, of care, you deserved it. You deserved to receive what you gave.
Thank you.
to so many.
That's all I wanted to do was care for people. That's why I teach.
I totally feel that from you.
Just want to love people.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And if they just said, hey, stay on for a year, please don't share your doubts with the students. And then we'll either give you some time to figure things out, or we'll support you with our human resources to find a replacement job and give you great recommendations. Like, wouldn't that have been compassionate?
That would have been amazing. Even if I had a conversation with somebody who said, yeah, here's what we expect for you as a teacher, and as long as you uphold that, you're great. Yeah. I would have done anything.
Yeah.
Almost anything.
So that's our constructive recommendation, BYU and Mormon Church, is do that for these people. At least give them a runway for either reconciliation or transition.
Yeah. If you're going to make my stuff personal, treat me with the respect as a person, not as a checkpoint.
Yeah. All right. Well, Margie, thanks for co-hosting this episode and producing it and making it happen.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Thank you, Louisa.
Yeah, Louisa, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
And don't go away. Come right back for part 2 of this interview with Louisa Killian. This is kind of a Thrive themed episode. So we're going to be talking about Margie's favorite part, which is reconstruction. Right, Margie?
I love it all.
Yeah.
I love the process and how it's kind of part of being alive in many, many ways.
Yeah. Me too.
Yeah.
All right. Come right back for part 2. Thanks so much. And we'll see you all again for the next episode. Thanks, everybody.